college is committed to local discussions and global discussions about resolving disputes peacefully and about instituting restorative practices. And it's our intent not only to support our faculty and our students at this university, but also to help support this network of collaboration throughout the globe. So we welcome you to this event, and we look forward to future opportunities for ongoing collaboration. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. And now I'd like to go over to Brian Polkinghorne to introduce our keynote speaker. And Brian is in Salisbury University. He's the director of the Bosserman Center of Dispute Resolution. He's also the founder of the Conflict Analysis and Dispute Resolution Department at Salisbury University. And now he's also a Fulbright ambassador. And so is really a person who's contributed greatly to our field. And so just want to honor Brian and also to welcome him and to allow him now to introduce Sean O'Callaghan, who will be coming in from the UK. Thank you. Brian, it's over to you.
Thanks, Brian. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we're good.
Okay. I am not going to try and switch any cameras or anything over on my end, so you're just going to hear me. But when Brian was putting this conference together a while ago, he was talking about speakers, and one of the themes that he mentioned to me was the whole notion of radicalization and terror and all these events going on around the world that are impacting people. And I said, I have a friend. He's a little hard to get a hold of, but if I talk to him, maybe he could come and speak with us. And it's Sean O'Callaghan. And maybe the best way to introduce him, rather than going through so many of his lives, because he's lived several of them, I just want to tell you how I first met him. Several years ago, a mutual friend of ours and I were on a tarmac at an airport in a country, and as we were going to the plane, the phone rang, and he picked up the phone and started, or the mobile, and started talking to somebody. He got really excited, and he is, oh my gosh, I got through to my contact, and we're going to be able to go see Sean, but the thing is, we're going to have to hustle. So we flew to another country and ran through the airport and made our way down to the train, just barely making the train. The train door closes, and we go hustling into London, and we get in the underground, and thank goodness Peter knew the underground really well, and we popped up, and it's nighttime, and it's raining, and it's cold, it's December, and we were running with all this baggage and whatnot, and we're told to stand at this restaurant and look up from across the street. So we're facing across the street, and Peter's on the phone, and he calls this contact. The contact gives the phone to Sean, and Peter's standing next to me, and he says, for F's sake, and looks at me, and I said, well, what? And he says, he's right behind us. And he wasn't in the restaurant he said he was going to be in. He's in the restaurant behind us. I think he wanted to check us out. I thought, well, what an interesting character. But I'll tell you this about Sean. He's lived quite a few lives. He's from Ireland. You'll hear his brogue here shortly. And as a young guy, he got up in with the IRA, the provisional IRA, and he was with the Southern Command. And he writes in his autobiography about the entire story. The autobiography, by the way, is called The Informer, the real-life story of one man's war against terrorism. In the line on the bottom, it says, the most important intelligence agent in the history of the Irish state. The reason being is, I'm just kind of skipping ahead here, is Sean wound up being a little disillusioned with what was going on and wound up informing. And he turned himself in and wound up serving a sentence, a lengthy sentence. I think it was 2 life sentences and 539 years. Does that sound about right? Yeah. And but by I guess mercy, he got pardoned, and his time since then has been spent basically combating fanaticism and the radicalization of youth. And the work that he's done post incarceration is laudable, and has somebody go from being somebody who freely admits he took part in, killing people, to somebody who wants to prevent other younger people, the next generation of Sean O'Callaghan's and whatnot, from getting sucked into the pipe dream. He's actually done extremely good work. And so when Sean agreed to take part in the conference, I was actually thrilled. And I know there's people thinking like, you're hanging out with an IRA guy. No, I'm hanging out with a guy who's doing some good work, who made some mistakes, freely admits it, and somebody who's really doing the best he can with the remaining days that he has to make sure that we make the world a better place. And so with that, Sean, on a personal note, I really appreciate you taking part in this. You've helped me out a lot over the years, and this is just another one thing I owe you sometime down the road. So, Sean, the floor is yours. It's your story. So have fun, and we'll get back with you in a minute.
Hello?
Sean.
Can I be heard? I'm just not.
Yes.
I can, yeah. Yeah, well, thanks everybody for, well, thanks for inviting me, and I'm, you know, I'm very happy to be here. Yeah, look, I'll run through sort of the main parts of my life story fairly quickly, really, because, you know, they are what they are. I joined the IRA, I joined the Provisional IRA when I was 15. I came from a family that was a Republican and nationalist family. I grew up in the southwest of Ireland, as far as it was possible to be from Northern Ireland and still live on the same island. My father's side of the family were very Republican. There was a long history of it and all of that. But basically, as a youngster, my interest in politics would have extended around, would have been socialist, would have been at least pseudo-Marxist anyway, at least an attempt at being a Marxist. Seemed like a pretty good idea. But basically, in Northern Ireland, once the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement started, which is a movement to look for equal rights for Catholics, or what we perceive to be the denial of equal rights for Catholics in Northern Ireland. And the reaction of the state to that, and everything turned very violent very quickly. And suddenly it seemed as if all the old narrative, the long historical narrative that very clear, very simple, basically the long historical narrative was one of sort of 800 years of British oppression, pretty much straightforward, very simple. And suddenly it seemed that old narrative, the guys like me thought was just old hat and dead and stuff, seemed like, stuff your grandfather did, essentially. Suddenly became very real. And then the revolution is there. It's not in Paris anymore. It's not in Cuba. It's on your doorstep. The whole thing has been short. For guys like me, it's all short-circuited. So I ended up joining the IRA. I went to jail first when I was about 17 for possession of explosives for a short period. I was still at school at the time, nominally anyway. And then I got involved full-time with the IRA, and I finished up in Northern Ireland in 1974, 1975. It's that far back. And I took part in a lot of attacks on police and army and bombings and armed robberies and all that sort of stuff. Two of those actions led to the death of a part-time soldier and the death of a senior member of the police special branch. But along the way, I guess that not having been born in Northern Ireland and not somehow having the same background, I'd never been oppressed by anybody. I'd never gone through this stuff. I didn't have any sectarianism. So my stuff was really sort of romantic. And once you quickly when you come from that sort of background, at least my experience was that you quickly get to deal with the very hard edge of it. And for me, it was increasingly difficult. I could go into long explanations. If somebody wants to ask some questions, of course, afterwards I will. But I'd rather sort of try and move on to get to what I hope I've learned, or some of what I believe I've learned. I decided to leave the IRA, something that you could do, providing you kept your mouth shut. And I left the IRA just before my 21st birthday. And later on, I went to England, I worked, I got married. And for some damn reason, I couldn't really leave Ireland behind me. And I can assure you that I tried. I started a fairly successful business, etc. Eventually, in 1979, I decided to come home. I contacted the Irish police. I rejoined the IRA, and I worked for the Irish government inside the IRA for the next 6.5 years. It wasn't for me like, an agent going into a different culture or an occupied country or being taught to join an organization. So even though I was aware of the dangers of it, I still would maintain that it wasn't as dangerous as going into a culture, an area, an organization I didn't understand. There was a lot of things happened in that period, you know, and I won't go into them all, but one was an attempt to kill Prince Charles and Lady Diana at the Dominion Theatre in London, which we stopped. Another was an attempt to import 7 tons of weapons from the United States, from Boston, which was stopped, and many, many, many other incidents. Anyway, eventually I had to leave fairly quickly. 2 years later, I did something that I felt I was always, well, I felt for a long time I was going to do. And basically I handed myself into the police, the English police, and admitted my involvement in those activities in Northern Ireland when I was in the IRA. And I was sentenced to, 2 life sentences and 500 and something odd years. 8 years later, I was released by royal prerogative. And then I agreed to do a book which I never really wanted to do, which was an autobiography. And I agreed to do it, but I don't believe for a second my heart was really in it. It's pretty sort of boring stuff. It wasn't what I wanted to do. But I did it anyway. And of course, as I came out, the Northern Ireland peace process was at least publicly making its way onto the stage. And, you know, I helped out in that a bit, as and when I could and wherever I could be most useful. It would be wrong to say that I played some kind of vital role in it. I didn't. But I'd long come to the belief that you don't make peace by shouting at your enemies. The first step in making peace is beginning to examine what you might have done wrong. And that sometimes means that you take up, you know, controversial positions to attack your own prejudices, your own thought, your own history, or your own learned version of that history. And I'm not saying that, quite frankly, in a sort of a wishy-washy, ultra-liberal, let's all be lovely way. I'm saying that it is a practical need to begin to understand that you haven't got the whole rights of the world on your side. And here, don't forget, we're talking about fairly extremist positions which have adopted extremist, absolutist, often simplistic ideas. To attack those can be rather uncomfortable. In my case, you know, it's kind of obviously knowing full well what I had been doing by joining the IRA and working against the IRA, and knowing the history of how informers are looked upon and all of that. So I deliberately called the book The Informer to attempt to challenge stereotypes. Because I was working for my government, my legitimate government, you know, and I didn't particularly care what anybody thought about that. But as that sort of peace process developed, I realized, or I began to realize, that top-down solutions are all fine. Politicians eventually decide, and perhaps people who, you know, eventually decides for whatever reason, sometimes completely self-serving because their position is so weak. Sometimes because they think they're on top. Now's the time to go for it. Who knows? The important thing is that what's happening on the ground. You know, if you've got a situation where people have been killing themselves for a lot of years, it's pretty unlikely that they're all going to love each other sort of on the Wednesday when it stops on the Tuesday. And what's actually happening on the ground? What is taking place on the ground? So the big political act can be done. But what we've discovered, certainly in Northern Ireland, what we've discovered is that the place is more divided in some respects. It's more sectarianized. There are constantly underlying tensions. It takes a hell of a long time. And it might be a mistake to try and push people to live in complete harmony. What might only be possible is that they recognize to some degree the reality of the situation and they bloody well grow up a little. Excuse the way I'm putting it, but that's how it can be sometimes. And that's the reality. And it's a damn sight better than them killing each other. But you know, the notion that you're going to integrate everybody and everybody's going to love each other and it's all going to be beautiful just might not happen. What might happen, as I said, is that people become aware of the realities of the situation and they agree, begrudgingly in some cases, to work within those realities for at least some period of time to give everybody a breathing space. But I've also, in years, got involved in different sorts of projects, and one of the bugbears I've got, and I don't know how this translates in other countries, but you know, if I just talk about a particular form of activity, which is, you know, let's call it Islamism or Islamist extremism. Certainly here in the UK and in Europe, the word radicalization and de-radicalization is used a lot, and there's all kinds of programs. Now, the word radical has a very long and sometimes honorable tradition. If you think of it in terms of England, I think in terms of people like John Stuart Mills. I think in terms of the radical liberal position that gave us the Great Reform Act, the universal suffrage in 1830, and lots of other things. Now, I don't believe for a second that people that want to drag us back to, you know, the 6th century or whatever, or believe in a very, very totalitarian, absolutist view of the world are radicals. I think there are no radicals to be found in there. That's what I believe. Other countries and other cultures may have a different perception of what radicalism is. So I'm just talking about where I am. And as sure as hell, if I tell some 14 or 15-year-old kid that he's a radical, he might just Google it and wonder what's not to be proud of. You know, he'll see all kinds of things, and he might just wonder what's not to be proud of. And he might meet you on the street and say, I'm a radical. Now, you know, it's a long and honourable tradition. And being Irish, I'm a bit promiscuous with words, and I'm not a pedant. But this sort of situation, you have to think very clearly about it. And you also have to think in a global sense. If, for example, you might feel, even though it's certainly not my responsibility, but you might feel that Islam needs a counter-reformation. Why then hand over the radical ground to a bunch of reactionaries? Why hand over all that territory when what is required perhaps is radical thinking and debate and all the rest of it? Why hand over that? Just hand it over unthinkingly to people that are totalitarian reactionaries. Why do that? So when I come to that, one of the things that strikes me about this is I'm trying to write, I've written a second book, and I'm trying to write a third book, which is primarily on fanaticism, or at least to try and ask questions about fanaticism. And for me, fanaticism is part of the human condition. I would trust and hope that none of you have ever killed anybody. I have. But, you know, on any given day, I'm capable of murder because I have murdered, and I'm capable of love, and I'm capable of beautiful thoughts, and I'm capable of ugly thoughts, sometimes in the same heartbeat. And I don't believe that I'm different from other people fundamentally. So every day, small things and big things, there's an internal debate going on. We live our lives through a series of small daily negotiations. So I really believe that the only dialectic really worth talking about, the fundamental dialectic, is the inner dialectic between ourselves, the battle between good and evil. So when I come across people who want to, you know, I sometimes describe them as people who are sort of entrepreneurs in the ever-growing security and terrorist industry, that seem to believe they constantly have to invent new phases, new words, new ideas. I always talk myself out of work because as far as I'm concerned, I say, listen, this is as old as the hills. Just stop it. This is about people. And people all the time produce true believers, zealots, fanatics. The people who carried out the recent massacres in Belgium and Paris, in another era, in another setting, in a more religious era or setting would be instantly identified as religious zealots. Now, every religion and every political ideology carries its extremists. I can well understand how people of the Muslim faith listening to me would think, but these people are not Muslims. And my answer is really not that different than anybody else. Every faith, every ideology, every life carries its true believers and its opinions. And what you've got here are people who are true believers, zealots, and there you come to a hard place. You come to a hard place because can you imagine Osama bin Laden worried about sharing the school run, or who's going to make the sandwiches today, or who babysits this evening? There are people that do not engage. They do not negotiate with other people. They know what your problems are. They're going to solve them, whatever you think. They love you, if you will agree with them. They care about you more than they care about themselves. We all know them. Talking about when it's carried to these extremes. Now, these people look for perfection. And when they sit and they look at what they want as perfection, anything that spoils the perfection will be eliminated. And we're all familiar with it as the final solution. It's the final solution to the problems. It will create on earth that great shining city on the hill where everything will be perfect. And anything that spoils their view of that perfection will be eliminated. Now, all along the way of that, what I'm trying to say is that it's right, of course, that we're not perfect. Call it what you will. Call it original sin. Call it the fact that we're utterly flawed. We are flawed people who engage internally in a dialectic between right and wrong, between good and bad, good and evil. Call it what you will. And that's as it should be, because that's what drives it on. That's what also brings all the beauty. That's what brings all the great things. That's what brings all the great changes. So, I'm trying and searching as much as I possibly can for simplicity. A form of simplicity that says that we deal with people, we deal with the human condition as it is, and we accept that that is actually the great task. And mostly I try to say to myself, not in any, sort of wonderfully great way, but basically, within the individual freedom I have, there comes a check on that, and that's a duty to other people. When in that situation, what I do, will it be to my benefit and to the benefit of other people that come within my range? And sometimes you're working with, and I don't work for any organizations, I just work for myself. I just get around on my own. But sometimes when you're talking with youngsters who have no aspirations, there's complete poverty of aspiration. And they simply have no concept of what somebody's talking about when they ask them what they want to be, because they just have no idea. Sometimes you realize that in that search for worth, in that for self-esteem, or call it what you will, there are good habits and bad habits. And a vast majority of kids, even from the lousiest and the poorest and the most disadvantaged and violent backgrounds, react as well. If the good deed brings them esteem, they react just as if the bad deed brings them esteem. And after that, it's a matter of habit. It's a matter of building up the sense that you get self-worth, you transmit self-worth, it comes back to you. But I'm not sure I've met a scrap of sense, and I might leave it at that. And then if there's any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. How's that?
Hey, Sean, this is Brian. That's great. Hey, Brian Jarrett, I think from a technological point of view, you might be in a better position to moderate this because we're getting split screens and stuff over here. But I'm sure there's plenty of people who would like to ask some questions of Sean or chime in with some of their own thoughts on what he just said. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to hand it back to you, Brian, okay?
that from the different audiences, different participants, practitioners, students, please feel free to speak now if you have a question or a comment on the topic of de-radicalization or anything Sean has spoken about. Please feel free to speak up now. Thank you. So who would like to go first? Just chime right in. Just feel free to chime right in. And you may have to unmute your mic now. Now's the time to unmute your mic when you're speaking, and then mute it again when you're finished speaking. Our mics are muted, Karen? Sorry, I think our mics were muted just there. But what I'm doing is requesting that you chime right in, and I hope you can hear me currently. If our mics are unmuted. Reza, are our mics unmuted? Okay, very good. So questions or comments for Sean, and now's your opportunity to chime right in. How about you, Musa, from Tehran, Iran? How about, I'm going to pick on you, Musa, to chime right in if you have a question or comment on this. And how are you doing, by the way? Can't hear me. Okay. All right. Anybody else?
Recording it. It's on.
It's not. Okay, if you have a question, please unmute your mic.
We have a question in Honolulu, in Hawaii.
Oh, great. Anne, good.
Hey, Brian, how are you? It's Anne.
Good.
Okay, go ahead.
Sean.
Okay, this is Richard Bradshaw at the University of Hawaii. Sean, you made a statement, something like considering what you did that could have been wrong is the first step in engaging your opponents. I would like to know, are you doing this with the hope of them reciprocating, or is this something that you need to do internally in order to prepare yourself for engagement with your opponents?
Hi, yes, thank you. I think it's something that you've got, in a way, you've got to do it for yourself. I mean, it's a very interesting question. The point is that I'm talking here really about sort of very learned, simplistic narratives of history, usually built around humiliation, you know, and they're very deep. And the key is that they're very simplistic and they leave out lots out of the picture because they have to. So I'm talking about a kind of let's call it an extremist viewpoint. Now, that's got to be questioned. If we're going to go anywhere, that's got to be questioned, because you're never going to be able to engage with the other guy who's got a completely different viewpoint unless you begin to do that, because somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to begin to do that. Hopefully both sides begin to do it, but it will always be people who are willing to challenge orthodoxies within their own tradition. And, you know, sometimes it's not a very enviable place to be. Most times you'll find there are people in the other tradition who begin, at least, if nothing else, to respect the fact that perhaps some of the most outlandish claims are being questioned, you know, on the other side of the hill. But that's where you've got to start, because if you just shout at the other guy, you're not going to get anywhere.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions? Comments or questions? So unmute your mic and then have your comment or question. Anybody else? Any of the different rooms? Yeah, I've got a question here on site at CSUDH.
Sean, thank you for joining us. Just to be open with you, I have a brother-in-law who is Irish and a goddaughter, a nephew. I very much have worked with the legacy of British oppression around the world. We actually have students here from Kenya. We had a pastor from Kenya many years ago saying we need to do restorative justice. Both Dr. Jared and I believe in restorative justice. I'm a victim offender mediator. Have you ever attempted this with the current British, that they would do truth and reconciliation or some form of victim offender mediation in Northern Ireland?
It's an interesting question. Look, I think part of the problem with all of that really is that where do you begin and where do you end? It's become apparent over the last number of years that when people continue to demand an investigation of the past, and they continue to demand inquiries or admissions or whatever you want to call it, from one side or the other side, one of the very interesting things that's happened is that sometimes you can see they wish they had never bothered. Because what tends to happen there is that very often it's never quite as simple as it seemed when it started. And unpalatable truths begin to come out. And we're sometimes watching situations where people are making calls for inquiries or investigations on either side. What's become noticeable, I think, is that in many cases, the calls have become more muted, as what begins to come out often tends to be a much more tangled web. And it's very, very interesting at what point, you know, this might sound like I'm putting this in a blasé way, you know, and I'm not by any means. But at what point after the divorce do you move on? If I can put it like that. At what point do you give the lawyers more money to go through? How much do you fight it? How much have you got a life to live? I mean, Václav Havel is a brilliant way of saying, you know, no problems with meditations on our past history, etc., etc. And I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, couldn't we begin to deal with the problems we face with now, and by doing that, make our own history? In other words, the danger is, I think, that by entangling ourselves in it, we become victims. You know, we continue becoming victims. And I know that's not the whole answer, and I know it's not easy, but I've been looking over the last number of years, obviously, at the stuff, and there is absolutely no doubt in my mind what appeared to be straightforward, simple situation, call for an inquiry or an apology, etc., has turned out to be much more complicated and seems to get never-ending and sometimes festers. And if you place Northern Ireland within the context of Great Britain and the Irish Republic and the European Union, and you place it in that context, as you try to move on, you begin to wonder how much you interfere with all of the legal process and all of these long established institutions by, you know, making allowances and moving away from and setting up alternative structures. I have to say that I'm certainly not against this, against them, but I mean, I'm wary of looking at, you know, long established methods of that have worked in many ways for quite a few years, and sort of saying, oh, let's just throw all that out and let's you know, are you going to give an amnesty, for example, to everybody in Northern Ireland? Because as sure as hell, if you're going to give it to some people, you're going to have to give it to everyone. Now, once you do that, you will always get people jumping up and down and saying, but they got off. You know, and how much of the legal system can you just ignore? You know, and what about the people who feel their family has been directly hurt in the very recent past, and they don't want you to give an amnesty to these people? How do you deal with all that? And I'm inclined broadly to the view that rather than festering around in the mess that in one way or the other we have all contributed to, we've got to try to make an attempt to lift ourselves out of it. It just seems to me that it goes on and on and on, and there aren't satisfactory answers at the end. There are no clean, simple, satisfactory answers of They were wrong and we were right, and it's as simple as that. It is very rarely as simple as that.
Hey, Brian.
We have a question here, and then we can go to your question. So we're just going to go to a question right here. Got it. Okay.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to come to a thing and disagree with the initial speaker. I think your view on rehashing, if I understood it correctly, is a little misleading in a way. And I think of Truth excuse me, Truth Commission down in South Africa, which basically seemed to me to be a wonderful way of actually resolving the types of disputes that you're saying just forget about and go forward. I may be misunderstanding you, but certainly that is an example contrary to what you're talking about. We have the same problem here in the United States. There's no question that we need, restorative justice within our system. And there the book by Professor Alexander, a lot of other material is showing the imbalance that we have in our own judicial system. And I'm a lawyer, so I'm aware of it. But anyway, I appreciate your reaction.
Sure. Well, I suppose what I've got to say is that I don't agree with you fully. Look, I think it's much more complicated than that. I think you look at when you're looking at particular situations, I immediately get a sense of, oh, hold on, when somebody's got a global answer to many, many localized problems. So Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa may well have worked. People have spent the last 10, 15 years looking at trying to set up a Truth and Reconciliation situation in Northern Ireland. And they failed. Everybody has failed to do it. Nobody believes anybody will tell the truth. It's all terribly raw. The situation between Northern Ireland, Ireland and the UK is utterly different than South Africa. There is a sense that awarding amnesties to everybody, most people, the vast majority of people who never hurt anybody, appear to be appalled by the very notion, frankly. And I think they've got to be considered. So I think that I genuinely believe that you have to judge the mood, tempo, and rhythm of the particular place and the particular time. And it's never going to be perfect. What would my view be? My view would be give everybody an amnesty and have a full Truth and Reconciliation process and be absolutely certain that everybody would tell the truth. That would be my view in an ideal world. It shows no sense of happening in Northern Ireland at all, because secretly nobody really wants it. And one of the reasons for that is that the conflict in Northern Ireland was incredibly incestuous. A very small area, a lot of people killed, a lot of people damaged. Some people know. They know in a very incestuous way that the person perhaps responsible for killing their husband or wife or daughter lives 6 doors away in the same village. You know, this is repeated constantly across the place. So you've got to be resurrecting this in courtrooms every day. And people will never be, many times people will never be satisfied they've got the entire truth. We've got to remember it's very small, very localized, and almost personalized. And that's a huge part of the problem. So, I mean, if you were asking me, you've had a historical situation, you have this horrible problem that it's created, whatever, you come to the end of it, and you have a Truth and Reconciliation process, everybody tells the truth and you move on. Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that it's not a one-fits-all size. It just isn't.
Salisbury University.
I have a question in Hawaii. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Anne, we'll go to Hawaii after Brian, your question.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, we got a quick question here from, just a second.
Hi there, Sean. My name is Torrin Hansen. I teach here at Salisbury University, and my areas of expertise actually dovetail pretty well with what you're talking about today. I teach about the Northern Irish conflict because my wife's from County Mayo, but and I also teach restorative justice. So this is a very interesting conversation. So I want to ask something completely different from that, because another thing about the Northern Ireland conflict was the peace process and how the peace process unfolded and how it could unfold in places like Syria, for example. And your focus on radicalization and de-radicalization is interesting for me because one of the conundrums faced by people in these kinds of peace processes is the degree to which you should bring in the sort of radical element. So one of the sort of strategic decisions you have to make is, do you just deal with the moderates and their sort of viewpoints when you're trying to bring people together, or do you have to bring in the extreme views? In the case of Northern Ireland, the provisional IRA, and on the other side, the paramilitaries representing the British. So I was wondering what your take on that is with the peace process. Do you feel like, and I know I guess there's no one size fits all, but in general, what's your take on whether radicals should be involved in the peace process?
I think it's quite simply very often a matter of timing. If you, for instance, in 1972, I was in jail. I was 17, and the British government decided to have some talks with the IRA. They didn't consult with anybody really worth talking about. They hardly consulted with their own government. At the time, the IRA the Sinn Féin didn't contest elections. The Irish government weren't consulted about the talks. Unionists weren't consulted about the talks. The largest nationalist party in Northern Ireland wasn't consulted. So what happens is you get 5 IRA leaders, you put them in a plane, in a helicopter, you fly them from Northern Ireland to London. They meet with the British Home Secretary, a couple of security guys and whoever. What we thought immediately, this is 1972, we thought, we're winning. We're winning. We've been elevated above every other elected organisation in the islands. We're winning. Of course we're winning. The Brits said they wouldn't talk with us. Now they're going to talk with us. You know what? We had no intention of talking with them. We just issued them with 5 demands, gave them a couple of weeks to get out of the country. And when they didn't agree, we went back to the stuff we knew, but with renewed vigor, because we thought we were winning. Now, I now, and did it, and for a number of years, have put that down to a particular form of British arrogance among the British certain British type of upper class conservative politicians. Mainly, they seem to think that it was about time we should have a look at these chaps. But I mean, everybody in Ireland knew who these chaps were, you know. There wasn't any great need. So what I'm getting at is that was a stupid attempt at bringing in, we'll say, the extremists or the radicals or people who are using violence, whatever way you want to describe it. By the time we got to 97, a horrible long way down the road, exacerbated, I believe, by the events of 1972, those, very short talks, you were dealing with a completely different organization. Almost the very same leaderships. The key people from the same leadership as were at the talks in 72. But they had slowly been brought to a recognition that what they wanted, on the terms they wanted it, was not going to happen. And I think the phrase one person used was, the flame wasn't worth the candle. What I'm getting at is that organization was now a completely different organization. It might not be presenting that to you publicly. It was now prepared to talk. The loyalists, they're also getting tired. Everybody is getting tired. And everybody is slowly beginning to accept that the deal that's on the cards is, broadly speaking, the deal we would have arrived at in 1974 if it hadn't been wrecked, mainly by violence on the loyalist side, pro-loyalist side. So what I'm saying is that timing in that situation of whether or not you bring in the men of violence, timing is what it's all about. And that's why I say that in every sort of peace process and in every negotiation, it's got an internal rhythm. It's got a rhythm and a life all of its own. And it's very, very important that you've got people there that have been around it a while, around the particular situation a while, and understand the rhythm and understand where it's taking place in a broader geopolitical context and what other pressures are being brought to bear.
Sean. Thanks, Sean. We have a question from Hawaii, University of Hawaii. Anne, go ahead. Go ahead, University of Hawaii. Anne, do you want to go ahead with a question there?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my question was almost identical, verbatim to the question that was just asked. There was just one more thing, and thank you for the answer. We're looking at things like, many of you may have read about the telescopes that we're dealing with and some of the radical voices that we have here just regarding that one issue. There are many, many more in Hawaii. But the one other layer to that is that while that radical voice is being heard and appreciating that, yes, timing does make a big difference in this, that voice is usually the loudest voice, and it sets the tone and temperament for the negotiation. And so that, is there anything while you're waiting for the time to come or for the time to be ripe to come to the table, how can you legitimize that radical voice and still let the other voices be heard?
It's an extraordinarily interesting question, and frankly, it's so difficult to answer when I put it like this, in a kind of a textbook manner or a manner that will apply. But one of the things, and this is not a great answer to your question, but one of the things I've found is that because the voice of the true believer or the fanatic or the extremist, it needs a simple narrative, it needs a simple story, it needs it to be fixed, and it needs another to distinguish itself from. And anywhere along the line, I'm not suggesting, there is a huge difference between negotiating and talking. A hell of a big difference. All kinds of people can talk through things, and all kinds of people can make little chinks in extremist armors, or just, one person begins to think, them Protestants are really bad people, but Joe's okay. It's a little chink. Now that's talking. That's not negotiating. What I'm saying is that talking will go on, and all kinds of parties can be used to talk, and, churches and groups and whatever can be used. I'm talking about when do you get to the stage, sorry for putting it like this, if it offends some people, but in the real grown-up world, where you're going to try to arrive at a solution, where do you begin the process of negotiation? When has the situation moved? When have the people you've talked to, when have the ears on the ground, the people that know stuff that's going on, when have you built up enough knowledge to be able to say, we think that we've got a good chance of pulling off a negotiation here because we can see roughly the parameters on which enough people might just agree to go with it. Maybe because they've got no choice in some cases. The game is up for them. And maybe they've covered that up. They're going to go with it. But talking and negotiating are utterly different things. It's crucial that we realize it. There'll always be talking in the prelude. But if you get your timing for the negotiations very wrong, you may well encourage an extremist voice, which will have a simplistic narrative, to believe it's winning. We used to think back in 1972, one last push and we'll drive the British Army out of Ireland. It was never going to happen. I mean, without going into the whole complicated situation, the Irish government didn't want it to happen because it just wasn't going to happen. We were not going to drive the British out of Ireland. But yet, we're more or less apolitical, we're on the road, and suddenly, out of nowhere, the British government fly our leaders to London to talk with them over the heads of everybody else. Now, they were going thinking they're negotiating. They've just brought their set of demands. They think they're representing the Irish people. You know, so talking and negotiating are utterly different things. I'm all for talk. All kinds of talk can happen. When you get into the business of negotiating, that's a whole different ballgame. You've got to be very careful that you've got a reasonable expectation, that you're not going to disappoint drastically one side, that you're not going to raise people's hopes. That, to put it quite bluntly, that you're not going to have a lot of other people saying afterwards, there's only going to be a military solution to this. You know, those guys don't want. The talking and negotiating are utterly different things in my view.
John, we have a question on our side. We have a question here. I'll just turn to my friend here.
Hello. Thank you for your comments. It's insightful. My cousin's niece was killed in Paris in November in the attacks. My nephew was killed by Al-Qaeda and the American government in Afghanistan. How do I stop hating the extremists? And how do the family members of the people that you killed stop hating you?
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? I was involved in an attack on a police and army base, in which a part-time woman soldier was killed, and I mean, I was as much responsible for her death in the fact that I was there. I took part in the attack, and the intent was to kill people. Years later on, I met her husband, and it was an extraordinary experience because it was a very humbling experience for me and a very extraordinary experience because he seemed to be, and I think he was, possessed of an extraordinary amount of forgiveness. And I'm not sure I'd have been the same way if it was the other way around. You know, quite frankly, I don't know. I got fairly involved in a situation where there was a major bomb in Omagh, Northern Ireland. There was 29 civilians killed and 2 unborn children killed. And the police never convicted anybody, but the families got together and decided to bring a civil case against the people they believe responsible. So I got a little involved in it. And the town that happened in was the same town where I murdered a policeman all those years before and also planted bombs in that town. I finished up working quite a lot with the relatives to bring this civil action. And deep down, I knew some of them could forgive me and some of them didn't really. And what you've just said and the question you've asked, you see, goes right to the heart of understanding the politicians can come and just talk about negotiating an agreement and, you know, we must move on and all of that. And it's all so bloody easy. But it's actually extremely difficult. And if we talk in grandiose terms about, you know, people matter, then somebody entirely innocent, hasn't been involved in anything, is murdered. And we think it's all going to be wave to wave. I've watched the relatives of that bomb in Omagh, that bomb I spoke about. And some have moved on in the way that I don't think they'll ever forget or forgive. But they've decided somewhere that they're not going to become victims of the people that killed their relatives. That they're not going to stay there. Somehow or other, they have a kind of a responsibility and a duty to either their children or the other people still alive in their family, and they've got to get on with it. And look, I'm in no position to say that's easy, and I'm not trying to. I really, really am not. But the people that have kind of said, I'm not going to forgive or forget in a million years, but we're going to get on with life. seem to be healthier in themselves. They seem to be healthier themselves rather than the people who are continuously stuck in it. I can find no better way to explain it. I mean, I don't know. What you've said to me is one of the things that makes me very intolerant of people that just imagine you're going to have some wonderful form of reconciliation. You know, well, it's not as simple as that. It demands an awful lot of people. It demands an awful lot of the relatives of innocent people who've been killed and have suffered. And, you know, without trying to put sort of some kind of moral, you know, sort of stuff on it, I'm just saying that you've got to recognize all of that. Really recognize it. And that's the bloody human dimension to it all, you know? It's all very well for a bunch of academics and a bunch of people to be saying, oh, yeah. You're dealing with real life people. And, you know, they're going to, you know, I'm not saying they've got a right to stand in the way of a process. I'm not saying they've got the right to stand in the way of people's desire for a new way of life or peace. They sure as hell have got a big, strong voice, though, or should have at least.
Turn the floor over to Dr. Salhi, who is the Associate Dean of the Business College. Social and Natural, how do we say it? Natural and Behavioral Science. And he'd like to say a few words here as well. So I'm going to turn that over here.
Oh, thanks. I think it's a fascinating question, and it's a very, very important question. But the way I look at it, and we look at what's happening in terms of radicalization and de-radicalization, negotiation or resolution, a common pattern is that any dispute resolution has to occur in a context. The outcome of a negotiation is dictated perhaps by the players, the political circumstances, and other conditions. Now, my interest, and when I look at the issue of radicalization and de-radicalization, I have in mind the Middle East conflict. And the Irish conflict is a clear indication that if you have a leadership intend to resolve a conflict and you have the main players on the same page, you can achieve a lot of things. In that context, de-radicalization become linked to negotiation, which sort of framed a solution that helped de-radicalize the radicals. Now, in the absence of that in the Middle East, I wonder whether we're missing a very important development. And the development is this. Currently, there is so much radicalization, or the radicalization of Islamists, so-called jihadists, occurs in the Western world, in Western countries, more than the Muslim world. And I'm not talking about specific cases like Pakistan, areas of conflict, but when you look at the number of recruits and the numbers that are sort of going to Iraq, going to Syrian conflict, all of that, a significant number of that comes from the Western countries. So you have a radicalization in the West. What we miss, and I believe, is there is a counter movement in the Muslim, in the Arab world. That the message of radicalization, for example, is no longer accepted. Using political violence, using atrocities to speak on behalf of the religion is really, in more ways than one, not accepted. And I understand there is a shift in the media, particularly in the social media, where this is illustrated very well by declaration by imams, by religious figures. So there is what? There is that. There is another thing that is happening, is that within the context of the mosques and imams in the region of the Middle East and the Muslim world, the message today is very, very clear. In the 80s, 90s, during Al-Qaeda days, the idea of inventing or creating a sixth way for those who follow the Islamist pillars pillars, we have 5 of them. But when Osama bin Laden, his mentor Azzam, introduced the 6th pillar, which is jihad, and talking about the near and far east jihad, that jihad is part of your religious duty. That concept today is not accepted in the Muslim world, but it still continues to be used in the Western world. A clear example of that is a continued insistence on using terms that portray the region from what it is not. The term ISIS, the term ISIL is very well rejected in the Muslim world. So the question to me is, when we talk about dispute resolution, when we talk about radicalization, de-radicalization, how much is we missing when we take the social, economic, and political environment that are actually happening outside the arena of negotiation? Can we negotiate today and bring the radicals to bring all the radicals to resolve and discuss the Syrian conflict? Those are without taking into account what's happening in the region, the political accounts, the political players, the leverage, all of that. If we don't take into account the political gaming of outside countries, of outside interest, will Syria, for example, or the Syrian leadership will Syrian people accept sitting down and negotiating with the so-called radicals? So to me, the radicalization and de-radicalization is closely associated with what's happening outside the tables of negotiation. And a table of negotiation, you could reach a solution if you have political intent, but that may not be enough to resolve the conflict.
Thank you, Hamoud. Anybody want to chime in? Anybody would like to chime in from any of the other universities, organizations? Any individual like to chime in? Please do so. Feel free to chime in on this conversation.
Yeah, Brian?
Yes.
Yeah, Ron DeWitt here. How you doing?
Okay. Hey, Ronnie. Yeah, great. Good to see you.
Good. I'm going to revert back to Sean here. I've got not a question, but a commentary, Sean. And by the way, I've got a little diverse from your background. I was 28 years in law enforcement, United States, most of it federal. I do have firsthand experience with terrorism, more specifically with the Islamic group of Egypt, and I personally do know Sheikh Omar Ratman, known as the Blind Sheikh, who was one of the provocateurs in the first World Trade Center bombing. I was at his second trial in 1995, Southern District of New York, where I was detailed to. Got to know him and his entourage very well, and that was at the point, in my career, my life, where I really became face-to-face with international terrorism, and I knew what it was about. And this may seem paradoxical, but I can relate more to you and your past experience than anybody else here today. There seems to be some kind of strange commonality here, I guess, even though we're opposite sides of the fence. Because I, too, have seen people die violently. I've seen the blood, so I know some of what you experienced. But I think your conclusions and analysis are very pragmatic. When a war is over or a conflict is done, that does not shut off people's hard feelings towards each other. That takes time. It takes patience, love, and understanding in the long term. You just don't shut feelings off like a light switch. You are correct in that. And I also, just to let you know, I'm retired, but I do teach at two different universities. University of Alaska, I teach several Homeland Security courses. And I teach world civilization, U.S. history at Wayland Baptist University. But what I teach my students when we study, I have a heavily focus on conflicts and wars. And throughout my years of research and pragmatic experience as a law enforcement officer and in the military as an infantryman, I've learned that at the root of conflicts, there's always three causations: political, religious, and territorial. If you look at the history of warfare and conflict. However, those in themselves, too, are merely superficial. They, too, have a root cause. And I adhere to your concept of original sin, by the way, Sean. I agree with that. But what it comes down to is man's lust for power and control. And what I've studied of conflict, that seems to be at the root. It's not complicated. That's what it is. It's man's yearning to, hey, I have a better way of running the world. I have a egalitarian society I wish to establish. And, by God, I'm going to create a caliphate, whether you like it or not. I'm going to ram it down your throat, or world communism, or national socialism, whatever it may be. It's always man's quest to be in charge for power and control. And I've learned that to be at the root of all our woes, historically speaking. What's complicated is our resolution to that problem. So I just want to know your take on that, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, look, broadly speaking, I agree with you. I've just written a book about an Irish guy called James Connolly. James Connolly was born in Scotland of Irish parents. John grew up in a serious ghetto, an Irish Catholic nationalist ghetto in Scotland. Joined the British Army when he was a young man, 14 years of age. Served 7 years in Ireland. Anyway, James Connolly became a Marxist. He was executed after the 1916 Rising 100 years ago. But James Connolly spent 7 years in America. At one stage, he was the chief organizer for the Socialist Party of America around the turn of the 20th century. And James Connolly believed that there would be a workers' republic that would cover the globe. And in that republic, there would be no poverty, there would be no corruption. He actually wrote that until the leaders of the working class learn to be as ruthless with their followers as the ruling class are in every war, only then will there not be a despotic throne or government left upon the earth. And he wrote that when he was about 40. He wrote several books. He was described by a leading historian in Britain as one of the only two original left-wing writers in Ireland or Britain. Connolly drank of the Kool-Aid of his day just as deeply as any jihadi. He fought with everybody. He wanted it his way. His way was the only way. If it wasn't his way, you were in trouble. The lust for power, our desire to control, gone insane. The geography might be different, the particular cause a little bit different, but there is a part, an extreme part perhaps, where, we have something in us, that fanatic, that zealot. The geography is right, history is right, combinations are right, social and religious, whatever. That little gremlin can pop its head out and it will do the most obnoxious, disgusting and evil things. Whatever the cause is, it can just seize the cause. It seizes the moment. It comes with it. James Connolly absorbed Marxism. He never questioned it for his entire adult life. It was right. It had to be right. It had to be perfect. It had to be absolute. It also had to convince him that what he was doing was utterly selfless. He was doing it for his fellow man, and eventually he would die for that cause. Now, that, when I was reading that book, when I was writing that book recently, I brought myself back again to Eric Hoffer, the author of True Believer. And these are scary books, the likes of True Believer, because they force you to question your own beliefs. That's why I said earlier on that the dialectic, that great old Marxist word, that the real dialectic, put it like that, is the internal one, the one against good and bad that we fight all the time. Does that offer us a solution to the problems of Syria? Hardly bloody likely, unfortunately. But does it give us an overview, and does it explain to us why, when the politicians might have arrived at a solution, we can still go on hating each other, and why it might take a long time? Does it make us understand or help us to understand why shouting at the next guy actually isn't doing, it's reinforcing your view and absolutely reinforcing his? So, look, broadly what you've just said, I agree with. This isn't, making peace is a tough game. It's not often, it's a tough game. It requires people that know what they're doing, that understand the rhythm of that particular situation. There is a core, and then there is the geography, the weather, the history, the social conditions all around it. You need people that understand it, and you need people that are serious about dealing with it and are going to spend quite some time doing it if necessary. What desperately we don't need is some sort of universal platitude which can be good in itself, but is not going to be able very often to be brought to bear on the problem in a practical way. And I'm afraid, like most problems, it's usually got a pretty practical way of going about it, or going about solving it.
We have a question from Tamara Alexander at the, thanks, Sean. We have a question from Tamara Alexander at the Orange County Human Relations Commission. Tamara, go ahead.
Hi, Brian. We're also down here with CSP.
Okay, thank you.
And our question is to reflect back on what Sean said when he was talking about being able to, thank you, not being able to push people to live in harmony, but the goal is to acknowledge realities in situations and agree to work with those realities to give everyone their own space. And so our question is, if those realities seem to be skewed, we're talking about this radicalization, de-radicalization project, but if those realities seem to be skewed, what suggestions do you have for us to be able to acknowledge and give space for those realities while maintaining some sort of integrity for our own space and for the peace process?
Thank you. I think in the first place, look, it does in the real sense. There is a sense it depends on the particular area and the particular problem you're dealing with. But suppose you've got, it was Che Guevara that said, there would be no revolution there could not be a successful revolution where even the illusion of democracy existed. Point is that if are you dealing with a class war? Are you dealing with a nationalist war? Are you dealing with an internal civil war? Are you dealing with a Manilian type movement that wants to take over the world? These are all different situations. One thing is for sure, we are dealing with people. That's for certain. And in it, while everybody is an individual and nobody will be created alike again, exactly alike again, at the same time, there appear to be certain similarities. It's why we read the great novels still, because they're going to be about lust, power, betrayal, etc. These great issues. These are the things that govern our very impulses. So it's really a kind of a mathematical formula. At what stage do people within a violent extremist group get worn down? At what stage do they begin, or some of them begin to think, hey, we're not going to win this at all? At what stage do people within a sort of a civil war situation, do they begin to think we're destroying our country? Where is this going to? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Where did the chinks start to arrive? But the one thing I would say is this, just take the Irish situation. In 1972, those elements of the British government that decided to meet with just the leadership of the IRA and put them in that time in that exalted position, they had, in my view, lost their integrity. They had thrown their integrity away because they hadn't considered the elected representatives on the Nationalist or the Unionist side in Northern Ireland. They hadn't considered the government of the Irish Republic or the people of the Irish Republic. They hadn't considered their own people, and they hadn't even considered most of the people in their own government. Now, when you do that, you fly people in and you give them that status, sort of out of nowhere in 1972. You have actually surrendered your own integrity. You're behaving in a delinquent manner. So so much of this depends on, look, say we're talking about a country. Do the vast majority of the country oppose the people who are engaging in violence? If so, their wishes must be paramount. You can't elevate the people who just want to kill some people, but are by no means, we'd say, the majority, over everybody else and give them an entirely special status without fatally undermining your own integrity and perhaps, and all the rest of it. You just can't do it. So I do keep coming back to something that says, the problem at the minute one of the problems at the minute we'll say let's call it Islamism. You can call it what you want. The brutal truth about that is that it is not representative of most Muslims, but it's born of Islam. It is of Islam. When a young jihadi, I see young guys on the edge of joining the jihadi groups. I've seen more of them in London than probably the intelligence services and the police combined, because I go around and talk to them. All of them tell me, one way or another, that what propels them is their belief in an absolute God. So here we've gone away from a territory. We've gone away from a civil war situation. We've gone away from, the liberation of a country. We've gone away from a class war. Now, we're in there into something that we may just have to fight to preserve the values of liberal democracy. I'm not saying that we should fight, for God's sake, please don't get me the wrong way, that this is an attack on Islam. I'm saying the actual opposite. But we may be dealing with political gangsters. And there certainly is, and there will be more political and social issues around the area that they can exploit. But, is anybody seriously saying to me that it would be a good idea for the French government to sit down and talk with the people that carried out the massacre in Paris and to try to understand them and see what they can do to accommodate them? There are certain areas, and this is why I say that this is an extraordinarily dangerous, difficult job. And it might sound like a bad thing to use. In the practical expression of trying to build peace, it's not a place for messers. It's not a place for people that have just got a little bit of goodwill in their back pocket. It's a serious business. And if you're messing around in it, you can do an awful lot of harm and hurt a lot of people and maybe make things worse. So it's a serious business. Every area, except for the ones I'm talking about, the internationalist, millennialist kind of idea, will have its own difficulties and its own problems. Best understood by people who know the rhythm of it, know the realities, can piece together the jigsaw. And I would rather that when you go for negotiation, that sort of, you got as much as possible so that it's like you're going into that negotiation hoping that most people have already arrived at a rough sense at least of what is possible, where you're going to. Trying to do it the other way, trying to force feed people into situations that they're nowhere ready for. And that might mean that they simply haven't been hurt enough. They haven't done enough of it. They're not ready to sort of pack in. That's what it might mean. You've got to try to understand all this before you go to the business of negotiation. That's my view on it.
Okay, Sean, we're going to move now and switch gears a little bit. We're going to switch gears now to University of Puerto Rico. We're going to go and talk to the law school, to David Wexler.